What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Coach's Quarters. I am your host, Jacob Meadows, aka Mr. Showtime, and we are going to bring you the Postcap for the Week 2 games, sans the Monday Night Football game, just because I am filming on Monday night. So I'm going to give y'all a little bit of Postcap on that one on the next show. But before we jump right in, I do think the Brownies beat the Steelers. And I do like the Saints over the Panthers. But again, I'm going to jump in on a little bit of analysis on that on the precap for the Week 3 games. So with that being said, we're going to jump right into the content. We'll start with the Thursday night game, the Minnesota Vikings versus the Philadelphia Eagles. And this was a neat litmus test of a game, right? The Vikings are 0-2. The Eagles are 2-0. My personal opinion, the Vikings have looked better than the Eagles, which is really saying something. It does look like the Eagles are missing. They lost their OC and their DC last offseason. So it is looking like they are missing their coordinators a little bit. They're not as crisp of a team as they have been in previous years, right? They don't look like the same team that made it all the way to the Super Bowl last year. And it's evidenced by the Patriots taking them to the final minute of the first game in Week 1. And then the Vikings were able to stage a wild comeback here in Week 2. So you look at the numbers, and Kirk Cousins had a terrific game. He went 31-44 for 364 and 4 touchdowns. Unfortunately, it didn't bring him a dub in the end. He only took 2 sacks. Like he was brutally efficient, to say the least. And I know if you watch the game, like there were definitely some dumb mistakes made by Captain Kirk. But overall, Kirk Cousins has been fantastic this season. He was fantastic last season. And if he's in the running for MVP, which this is an unpopular take, but if he's in the running for MVP, like he should strongly be considered. Kirk Cousins looks fantastic. This is the best version of Kirk Cousins that any of us as consumers have received to date. Whereas on the flip side of the coin, Jalen Hurts went 18 for 23 for 193, a touchdown and a pick. I know you can't discount the fact that Jalen Hurts also uses his legs on the ground. He had 12 for 35 and 2 touchdowns on the ground. That's only a 2.9 yard a carry average. The Eagles run game, the quarterback run game is not as good as it has been previously. DeAndre Swift had a career day on Thursday. He had 28 carries for 175 and a touchdown for 6.3 yard per carry average. That was amazing. He did all of that on my bench in one of my fantasy leagues. So, shout out to DeAndre Swift. Dude had a fantastic week too. But it was a tale of 2 different games, right? The first half, the Eagles buried the Vikings. The Vikings looked confused. The Vikings looked like outside of Justin Jets, it didn't look like the Vikings really had all that much going for them. They have no run game. Alexander Mattison's not very good so far. And I know he's got that whole thing going on where he's receiving racial messages on Instagram and this, that, and the other, because he's gotten off to a really, really slow start, which sucks. And, as people that consume this sport and people that watch football, you never want to hear stuff like that. But he has been pretty morbidly bad, and the longer the season goes on, if this continues, a lot more people are going to question why they let Dalvin Cook go, because Dalvin Cook is receiving 3 times the carries that Breece Hall is for the Jets, and Breece Hall is arguably a better back this young in his career, injury or not. So it brings that into question, because the Minnesota run game has been abysmal at best. So honestly, that's what it's looking like is causing these deficiencies for the Vikings, is there's nothing to take away from the passing game, right? If the Vikings line up and what is a primarily running formation, teams stack the box against them. And then when they're not running those formations, they're playing with an extra D-back in the backfield so that Kirk Cousins can't easily get a ball off because they know you're not running the ball. The Minnesota had 9 total carries in Week 2. Just 9 handoffs. And for an organization that claims that they would like to go to the Super Bowl, that is not a winning formula. You have that. And then on the Eagles side, right, you have 48 total carries on the ground. And I know that Kirk Cousins threw more passes, right? He had 44 total attempts versus Jalen Hurts 23. But the Eagles were able to control the clock all game. And you do that via a run game. So it brings into question, one, what is the offense? What is this offensive mentality that the Vikings have where they have to launch it through the air every play of the game? And then also, why is there such seemingly distrust in the running game after Madison showed that he was good enough to take Dalvin Cook's place in the first place, right? And obviously, you know, the Philadelphia Eagles have a better defense. They've had a better defense, and they've only gotten better, right? The player personnel on Philadelphia's defense is markedly better than it was last year. And the Vikings defense has not necessarily taken this giant leap that the Eagles have. But it shouldn't matter this much. It really feels like the Vikings want this. They want their entire game focused on the passing offense that exists in Minnesota, and they're willing to take maybe lesser talent elsewhere on the team. But obviously that's not working, right? Obviously Minnesota's not getting what they want. They wouldn't be 0-2 otherwise. But I don't know. It's an interesting game because Minnesota was able to come back. You know, Philly looked bad the back half of the second half, and Minnesota was able to stage a comeback, and it really came down to the final seconds. You know, Minnesota had a shot that final drive, and they may have squandered it, but if they hadn't, this game, we would be talking in a totally different way about this game because Minnesota would have toppled the Giant. The reigning second place for the Super Bowl from last season would have lost, and you know, what is Philadelphia doing at 1-1 in a stacked NFC East, and you know, this, that, and the other. That didn't happen. So Minnesota needs to be questioning kind of where they're going as a team in general, because you're not going to win the big games with no run game. You can win big games with some run game, but having 9 total carries for 28 total yards is not the answer. That is not the way you want to do it. You're going to run into more issues than you are otherwise. So it was a good game. You know, it was fun to watch. The first half was a little less good than the second, but the Vikings really have a lot more questions than answers at this point because it's almost like they took a step back despite the fact that this was a less worse loss, for lack of a better way of putting that. So this was an interesting game because I think the Vikings bounce back. I think the Vikings are one of the best teams in their division, if not potentially the best team in their division. They really just need to figure out the odds and ends of what they really want to do, because what they have rolled out so far in this season has not been effective. And anybody would be excited to see any team do better, right? But the Vikings really need to get a grasp on what they're doing quick, because there's already a couple of teams in that division that look better and that look like they're maybe responding better to in-game adjustments, and they're able to come out and put together a whole portfolio of a game every week and are able to overcome some of the adversity that maybe the Minnesota Vikings are not up to this point. And that's not to take away from the Eagles. The Eagles have looked good. Again, maybe not as good as last year, but the Eagles they still look good. They're learning to play with one another. They have a lot of young talent that they brought in they're still trying to learn the speed of the NFL and whatnot. Like, the Eagles will get better as the season goes on. The Eagles should be big contenders in the NFC again this year, but so should the Vikings. So it is early in the season. We're only 2 games in, so there's plenty of room to improve. It's just the Vikings need to improve a whole hell of a lot faster than Philadelphia does at this point. Moving forward, the second game on the slate is going to be the Las Vegas Raiders and the Buffalo Bills. This game was awful. I have Josh Jacobs on one of my fantasy teams. It was a panic pick, but I have him nonetheless. He ended up with -2 yards on the game. Jimmy G did not look crisp in this game as he did in week 1, and naturally it's against a better defense in Buffalo, but there is no excuse here. The Raiders were bad. Jimmy G went 16-24 for 185 for a touchdown and 2 picks. He took 0 sacks. That's not to say he wasn't pressured all night, because Buffalo does have a good pass rush, but the Raiders look like they look like the Raiders of last year, right? The Raiders just couldn't get out of their own way. They didn't look good. They were sloppy even when they were playing minorly well. And it's one of those things where the Raiders came out, they were number one in their division after week one. They got a head full of confidence, and then they laid an absolute egg in week two. And honestly, I would look more towards the Raiders doing more of week two's performance versus week one's. You know, if they play like this anymore this season, they'll be eliminated from playoff contention by week 10 of the regular season. Like they just couldn't get anything going. You know, their run game was bad. Trey Tucker had 1 carry for 34 yards. Zamir White had 4 carries for 22. Jimmy G went 1 carry for 1 yard. Josh Jacobs had 9 for -2. And as much as I want to make the excuse that Josh Jacobs missed the entire preseason courtesy of a contract dispute and, you know, this, that, and the other, he has sucked this season. There's no way to sugarcoat that. You know, he's been with the team now for a couple of weeks, and he is just not good. And for somebody that was fighting for such a large contract, he's making the other running backs look bad. I made a joke this weekend. You know, Mark Davis didn't have to go out and, you know, just tank the run game on purpose. They didn't have to pay Jacobs. And this was seen all across the NFL this week. And I'll end up covering all the teams that did this, but the Raiders looked bad. There was very little room for optimism. You know, Devontae Adams is good. Devontae Adams, pound for pound, is arguably the best wide receiver in the NFL, and I do stand by that. I think with a better quarterback or a better system or better support around him where he's not getting double and triple teamed every play, Devontae is the best wide receiver in the NFL right now, but he did not look that part yesterday. He had some incredible catches, but courtesy of an offense that couldn't put the ball in his hands in the moments that mattered the most, plus a concussion in the second half, or a potential concussion in the second half, he didn't have that game that they needed him to have. He scored their only touchdown. That's great for fantasy users, but it didn't even come close to helping them be competitive in this game. And mark my words, they weren't competitive whatsoever this game. Like it looked like Buffalo controlled the tempo right out of the gate, and then they just never let go of that. You know, Josh Jacobs was better in the receiving game than he was in the running game with 5 for 51. Hunter Renfrow hasn't been included in this offense at all, and there was trade speculation around Renfrow in the offseason, but they decided not to move him. So naturally, at least in my opinion, I expected them to use Hunter Renfrow, who is one of the better slot receivers in the league, but they're not. They are not getting him the ball. He is not their go-to target, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense considering they're also not taking advantage of their tight ends. You know, Austin Hooper is good. Austin Hooper was good for the Falcons. Austin Hooper was good for the Browns. And Austin Hooper's been a non-factor more or less for the Raiders. So it's like McDaniels only wants Jimmy G going deep. And the biggest knock on Jimmy G since he's been in the league is that his deep ball's not the best. That was a big knock on him in the offseason, is that Jimmy G doesn't necessarily have a deep ball. What are the Raiders going to do? And in an attempt to prove everyone wrong, I guess, all they're throwing are deep balls, or they can't connect on their shorter passes, and it's absolutely crippling the Raiders right now. They're having so many problems moving the ball that it looks like they're still stuck in the preseason while everybody else is advancing and they're improving and they are, you know, building on a regular season towards a playoff berth, which is what Buffalo is doing. I mean, I know Buffalo took an L against the Jets in week one, but that was a one-off considering, you know, Aaron Rodgers got hurt, there were emotions in the air, and they weren't necessarily able to beat a quarterback that they didn't game plan for. Not to mention, the run game was really good. And when the Jets' run game or anybody's run game is working really well, it is hard to stop because once they're hot, most teams stay hot at least for a half. So the Jets were able to outlast them. But the Raiders never got anything going on the ground whatsoever. The Raiders never got anything going through the air whatsoever. And the Bills just ran rampant on the Raiders. You know, Josh Allen went 31 of 37 for 274 and 3 touchdowns, no picks. He had 3 picks in the first game, so this was a huge turnaround for Josh Allen. You had James Cook, who absolutely killed it on the ground with 17 carries for 123 yards. And then even behind him, the depth was better. The depth for the Bills running backs was better than any starter for the Raiders running backs. Damian Harris, 7 for 33 and a touchdown. Latavius Murray, 6 for 22 and a touchdown. Is James Cook's lack of touchdowns something to monitor? Sure, but he's not getting goal line carries. Who cares? He's better in space than anybody the Raiders have. He's better in space than anybody else the Bills may have. So it's one of those things where, the things started to click for the Bills. Maybe this is the Bills we're going to see more throughout the season versus what we saw in week 1 with all the mistakes. But Gabe Davis led the Bills in receiving yards. Stephon Diggs had a pretty decent game. Dalton Kincaid's getting worked into the offense earlier than most people expected. That was probably my biggest takeaway, is that Kincaid had 5 for 43 and Dawson Knox only had 3 for 10. Granted, Dawson Knox had the touchdown and Kincaid didn't, but you love to see the rookie tight end come in and make a legitimate difference for their offense in the first year in the NFL, and that's exactly what Dalton Kincaid is doing. He has given the Bills an extra edge in the offense, where Josh Allen has a reliable target that he can get the ball to, that can do something with the ball in his hands. And he did against the Raiders. And, this was a great game for the Bills. If you're a Bills fan, this was a fun game to watch because they spit roasted the Raiders all game. But if you're a Raiders fan, you've got to question whether or not the team you saw in week 1 was a fluke, because they looked bad and they looked unprepared. And that all falls on McDaniel's head, the head coach. I mean, you can't roll out after a dub and just expect other teams to fall down at your feet, and that's exactly what it looked like they did. So my big takeaway for this is that the Raiders really, they might not have that identity that they pretended to have after week 1, and then maybe the Bills are going to be okay. There was a lot of panic around the Bills in week 1. You can't beat Zach Wilson at quarterback. The Jets have holes that you weren't able to overcome. The pass rush wasn't necessarily all of that in week 1, despite a Jets' bad offensive line. But I feel like they really silenced a lot of the problems that cropped up in week 1. So good on the Bills. This was a huge improvement. The Bills look like they're trending towards the correct direction. The Raiders, however, do not have that. That's not going in their direction. That's not in their favor whatsoever. The Raiders did look bad. I would look more for Hunter Renfrow to be more involved in the game. When you have a top, 10 slot wide receiver that you just absolutely don't use, at some point it's going to click that guy is important, right? Devontae Adams can't do it all. So I would look for Hunter Renfrow to be more involved in the game moving forward. That's got to be something that comes up in the film room. I would look for Austin Hooper to provide more receptions and probably more targets moving forward. Again, if the deep pass isn't working, the dink and dunk will. Something's going to be open. So you're either going to have the tight end open down low or in the mid, or you're going to have your slot wide receiver running short, quick routes just to take that pressure off of Jimmy G, right? So the defenses are the defense for the Raiders is a little bit different of a story. The defense did actually do pretty well. Bob Spillane had a good game. Divine Diablo looks terrific finally. Max Crosby looked good despite not necessarily getting the quarterback this game. So it's one of those things where the Raiders defense probably looks a little better than it does on paper if their offense wasn't so just god awful all game. So the big takeaway here has got to be the inefficiency of the Raider offense. No matter what you want to say about the defense and the fact that the Bills were just scoring at will, the Raiders defense was tired quickly. Their offense could not hang on to the ball. They couldn't contain drives. It is just one of those things where they were putting the cart before the horse and they got nowhere with it. Right. So that is my big thing here, is that it's not necessarily, I like the Bills. I don't think that I didn't think or don't think that the Bills make the playoffs. Although with the Jets completely gone, it's the Bills division unless Miami chokes it off, which Miami looks good, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the Bills could easily make wild card if somebody else were to take the 1. So it's not, you can't hit the panic on the Bills, especially after this second game. It'll be interesting to see what they're able to do week 3, just to kind of see where they're going. Again, every week until week 8's a litmus test, just to see if they're fakers or if they're actually going to be making a push. But my number one takeaway is that the Raiders are not good. The Raiders have a lot of work to do, and it feels like it falls on the Raiders' leadership, because since McDaniels took over at head coach, it's been a lot of this. A lot of looking unprepared, a lot of looking sloppy, a lot of not utilizing the players that you should be using, the players that have a foundation there, know what they're doing. It has been a very common occurrence for him here in Raider Nation. So that's my big takeaway from this game, is that the Raiders look more lost than not after 2 weeks than they did in the preseason or after week 1. Moving on to the third game of the slate, and one of my favorite games of the weekend, bar none, the Lions and the Seahawks. One, I have to cheer for the Seahawks because I have a litany of their players spread out amongst my 3 fantasy teams that I have going this year. But also, I've been a bandwagon fan of the Seahawks since the Sean Alexander and Matt Hasselbeck days, right? Legion of Boom was dope. Love the Legion of Boom because they were winning a bunch. But I've been a closet Seahawks fan for years and years and years. And on the flip side of that coin, I love Motor City Dan Campbell, man. Dan Campbell is an awesome head coach. He has breathed life into these Lions. The Lions are fun to watch. They are slinging the rock. And this game was marred by questionable referee calls and a couple of boneheaded decisions. And I'm not going to comment on the refs or anything. You know, that's a variable that every team puts up with. And the whole no permanent officiating because of the union and this, that, and the other, whatever their excuse may be for not having full-time officials, we see a lot of this every year. So it shouldn't fall on one team or on the refs to make one call correctly at the end. If the team would have just played better throughout the game, right, it wouldn't have come down to that last second decision. However, there were some crazy last second decisions by the refs in this game, and it does seem that it has created quite a controversy for the overtime victory by the Seahawks. But with that being said, we'll dive right into it. Geno Smith looked really, really good. Jared Goff looked really, really good. The defenses were not great. My biggest knock on either of the defenses for this game, which there should be multiple, but the biggest one feels like Aaron Glenn. Aaron Glenn is the defensive coordinator for the Detroit Lions, and it really feels, after 2 weeks, it is starting to feel like Aaron Glenn is awful at mid-game adjustments. It doesn't feel like he is changing anything that he's doing going from the first to the second half, even if they're not doing well. And I don't know. It just feels like if a team is doing something that is working against the Lions, Aaron Glenn can't actually bend his game plan to stop that. And that has been a reoccurring theme for 2 weeks now, and it is absolutely worth monitoring because Aaron Glenn might be out at the end of the year if the Lions defense ends up being what is costing them. They went out and they spent so much money on defensive players. They have so much talent. And for what we got as a product against the Seahawks, where Geno Smith made a bunch of boneheaded mistakes, DK Metcalf left the game for a little bit with an injury. It's one of those things where you've got to be able to do something more with the personnel that you have. Seattle didn't have much of a run game. It was a weird game. For a final score of 37-31 Seattle, this was a weird game for Aaron Glenn's defense. You know, their offense wasn't necessarily what it could have been. David Montgomery lost a fumble prior to getting hurt. Now he's day-to-day. They're saying that it might be a couple of weeks before Monty even comes back. Jahmyr Gibbs got a couple more carries than he did in week 1, did absolutely nothing with them. And it's just one of these things where things weren't going correctly for the Lions, and despite that, they were able to overcome, and they almost won this game. Again, this game was won in overtime on a controversial call, so you can't knock them too much. They were in it the entire game, and they, despite not maybe looking as crisp as they should have, they still put up a crazy game. You know, Jared Goff went 28-35 for 323 yards, 3 touchdowns, and a pick. That pick being ultimately what costed them this game at the end of the day. David Montgomery had 16 carries for 67 and a touchdown. But behind him, the run game fell off real hard, and the run game wasn't very good with him to begin with. Jahmyr Gibbs had 7 for 17, no scores. Khalif Raymond, their wide receiver, had one for 11, which is great for an end around. 11 yards is something that you would take every time on those plays. But then you had Craig Reynolds with 3 carries for 7 yards and no score. So they were heavily relying on David Montgomery again. He was less good than he was in week 1. And it didn't feel like the offense schemed around Jahmyr Gibbs as much as they said they were going to. I know Jahmyr Gibbs was very active in the passing game, and that is what they really said they were going to get him more active in. But with David Montgomery's really lack of production on the ground, you would have thought that their star, early round draft pick running back may have gotten a couple more carries or maybe been schemed into the offense a little better. But albeit he was not. Right, their receiving core looked pretty okay. Amon-Ra St. Brown looked good again. It is starting to look like this kid's going to end up being a star in the NFL. He got hot last season and hasn't let off the gas at all this year. 6 for 102, no touchdowns, but 6 receptions for 102 yards is a fantastic stat line. Would you have liked to have seen him to see more targets than 7? Maybe, but Jared Goff was really moving the ball around. The big star of Detroit's offense, in my opinion, outside of the people that are carryovers from last year that were really good, Josh Reynolds has been fantastic this season. If you have Josh Reynolds as a free agent in your fantasy league, I'd scoop him up immediately. He was good in week 1. Week 2, he had 5 for 66 and 2 touchdowns, which is fantastic. He had 6 targets. That was tied for 3rd on the team in targets. He had a lot of targets in week 1. So it does look like Josh Reynolds is becoming more of a fixture in this offense, at least until Jameson Williams comes back, which when JMO comes back, it is going to cut into his targets. But he's already established pretty great chemistry with Jared Goff, so I would look for him to be a pretty consistent target option for the bulk of this year. Behind him, you have rookie Sam Laporta at tight end, who, again, fantastic. He had a really good week 1. He came back with a week 2 that was also very, very promising with 5 for 63. Khalif Raymond, same guy that had the carry for 11 yards. He only had 2 catches on 3 targets, but he did the most with them, having 46 total yards overall. And then Jahmyr Gibbs, you have 7 receptions for 39 yards on 9 targets, which actually led the team. So that's all well and good, but the dink and dunk wasn't what they necessarily needed, right? So it would have been nice to have seen Jahmyr Gibbs more used in the run game, especially after David Montgomery got hurt. It just felt like he never really got a chance to use his legs for the running game versus the passing game. Again, no knock, he was used much, much more in the passing game, and that is what we're to look forward to in the future. But, we're definitely going to get a taste of him week 3. He's slotted over David Montgomery on the depth chart moving into week 3, courtesy of the thigh injury to David Montgomery in week 2 against the Seahawks. So that'll be something to keep an eye on moving forward. On the flip side of the coin, Seattle, there were times in this game that it felt like Seattle couldn't get out of their own way. There were times where Geno Smith held the ball for too long. There were times where he threw the ball away when really he had somebody that he could have thrown to. And when you're in the heat of the moment and playing quarterback in the NFL, the windows are so small, you're moving so quickly. Naturally, you're going to miss things. But despite his pretty decent stat line, Geno could have had a much better game. And the fact that Detroit wasn't able to capitalize on that is a telltale sign that, maybe Aaron Glenn ends up on the hot seat. And I don't think Dan Campbell could even come close to the hot seat. But after the second game, if they play more like this than they did in the first week where they were able to beat the Chiefs, despite the issues that the Chiefs had, Detroit's got to win these games. And just like the Chiefs, Seattle Seahawks are a playoff team. So being 1-1 against previous playoff teams, it looks good on paper, but you've got to win these games, especially when this division is going to be hotly contested. If the Saints manage to lose tonight, Monday night, the song will be sung in a different tune, courtesy of the division not doing well in week 2 overall. But this is also the opportunity that Detroit could have taken to be on top of their division, and squandering that is not what they want to do. Anyways, the Seahawks, Geno Smith did end up having a good game, 32 for 41 for 328 yards, 2 touchdowns and no picks. He only got sacked once. His QBR was a 79.4. It was higher than Jared Goff's. Not a bad game by Geno Smith. He is a game managing quarterback, and he managed this game, right? They ended up winning. Good teams find a way to win no matter what. So props to Geno Smith. This was a very Geno Smith-esque game, despite the fact that it probably shouldn't have been. You had a decent run game for Seattle. However, they didn't have a whole lot going. They were great in the red zone. The Seattle run offense was great in the red zone. They just weren't necessarily moving the chains like they should have been, which this goes back to, Geno Smith could have had a better game if the run game was really clicking in the middle of the field as opposed to just on either goal line. But you did see 2 scores out of Kenneth Walker. He only had 43 yards on 17 carries, but he did find the end zone twice, which, looks great for fantasy owners. And it did propel the Seahawks to victory. But you would like to see better production out of the running backs. They made a huge deal about Zach Charbonnet coming out of the offseason, and the dude's been an absolute non-factor in the first 2 games. I understand that he's not getting a lot of carries, and he's not getting a lot of actual play time, but they made him out to be the next best thing, and he hasn't been that. Thank God Kenneth Walker is firing on all cylinders to a point. Because Zach Charbonnet has not been able to get anything going in any sort of a realistically good way. Geno Smith was second on the team in carries or in yardage with 3 carries for 20 yards, and QB scrambles are different than designed runs. However, that's a stat worth monitoring because Seattle has had a lot of issues having consistency at the running back position since Marshawn Lynch was there. So are we looking down the pipe of a similar Seattle team where they're going to make a huge push, they're going to end up looking pretty good in the reg, and then you get to the postseason and they don't have the run game to really prop up an offense that can make a deep run in the playoffs? That's what it looks like through 2 weeks this season. It's still way too early to tell. This is all just really, really early panic button that's for clicks and views, but you've got to wonder if Seattle's got an issue in their run game already. And that just isn't good for Seattle. Again, I love Seattle, but you've got to get more production out of your run game if you want your passing game to click. Seattle didn't have a single receiver that went over 100 yards, despite Geno Smith throwing for over 300. Is that a bad thing? No, Geno spread this ball out all over the place. He had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. He had 9 different players catch a ball. That's fantastic. You had 2 or more receptions or targets for every single person but one on that list. So it is telling that they are throwing more than they are running because they potentially don't trust their run game as much. However, you've got to have a more balanced offense than what they have, and they won. So this is all just dust in the wind, right? Because they were able to pull out the victory. But you're going to want to see a bit more of a balanced attack. That way you don't have 10 targets going to Tyler Lockett, but only having 8 catches for 59 yards, despite the 2 touchdowns that he had. Right, 59 yards on 8 receptions is not a good stat line. I don't care where you play on the field. DK had a good game with 6 for 75 on 6 targets, but he got hurt at some point in the game. So it's one of those things where if DK gets hurt and Tyler Lockett's the only receiver you have, what are you going to do? Noah Fant looked pretty good with 4 for 56, but after him, it falls off pretty rapidly. So I would like to see more Jackson Smith than Jigba. He had 5 receptions, but wasn't able to do anything with them. Maybe they can scheme him into a different part of the field. Maybe they can try and run some rub routes to get him into the open field, because his telltale, like what he is good at, is yak yards, right? Yards after the catch. So it's strange that Njigba only had 34 yards on 5 catches. They are spraying their tight ends right now. They had 6 total targets to their tight ends and Will Dissly and Colby Parkinson. But then you add the 4 for Noah Fant on, and Geno Smith is targeting his tight ends more than he's targeting his receivers. So it's almost like they have supplanted the run game that they are missing with dinks to the tight ends, and that's only going to carry you so far. There are teams in the league with a much better linebacking core than the Lions. There are teams with a much better pass rush than the Lions. So it's one of these things where Geno's really going to have to get out of his own head, and the offense in general is going to have to do a better job of being multifaceted. You can't get cornered. 17 for 43 with Kenneth Walker means that they were very one-dimensional. Their run game was not working outside of the red zone. So when that happens, defenses can stack the box against the run game. And then when you're not in a classic run formation, they can run nickel or they can run a dime defense, and they can really, really push your quarterback into making dumb throws. So this was one of those games where it was a good game. It was a really good game. And it is early in the season. I'm going to beat that horse into the ground. But there is so much room for improvement on both sides, right? The Lions really need to do a better job of being better, right? Their defense is their big issue. Their offense is good. Jared Goff needs to not make those stupid interceptions, which he has been plagued by his entire career. But their defense was more the problem, whereas Seattle, their offense could have been better. Seattle got a lot of help from the officials. They got a lot of help from the refs. So you've got to be more efficient on offense. Despite what they posted, you've got to be more efficient on offense. And then, the defense wasn't perfect either. Their defense was better than their offense. And again, Seattle won. So this is all, it's nickel and diming it. But their defense could have been better. Their defense played pretty freaking good, all things considered. It was the Lions defense that really stuck out because they never had an answer. Seattle was able to really bend Detroit's defense to what they wanted them to do. And that's not how it should be, especially going into the second half. If Aaron Glenn makes a halftime adjustment, maybe we get a little better out of this. I don't know. This one's got me at a bit of a loss. I watched the game. I enjoyed watching this game, but I am a little disappointed in what the Lions were able to do. Naturally, again, I was cheering for Seattle because of my fantasy teams, but in my heart of hearts, I really wanted Detroit to take it. I took Seattle to win in my gambling show that I had a lot more hits on than I expected to, and Seattle ended up not covering. Moneyline would have hit. They ended up not covering the 4.5. So it's one of those things where it just felt like Detroit could have done a little bit more and posed a bigger threat. Detroit should have won this game. With everything that went on, Detroit should have won this game. And I would definitely look for a Detroit bounce back in week 3. It's definitely something that can happen. And on the flip side of that, Seattle is only one game behind first place in their division. Unfortunately, San Francisco's sitting at the top and they look really good, which I'll hit on later. But Seattle's a better team than the Chargers right now. So despite being third in their division per se, Seattle's actually second place. There's room for improvement. Seattle can make a real push for wild card, or if San Francisco takes a step back, they could end up taking that first seed in their own division. The Lions are slated second place behind Green Bay, who also lost this weekend. So Detroit's got less of a journey to make it. They have a much, much worse division, unfortunately for Seattle. But if Detroit really wants to make a push, I don't know if Detroit can beat Green Bay, not being able to adjust to an offense. Say Aaron Jones really gets cooking. I don't know if Detroit is going to be able to make the adjustments that they need to make in order to stop that run game and force a Jordan Love to beat them through the air. And that's exactly what we saw against Seattle. And realistically, it's what we saw against Kansas City. Kansas City bit themselves in the foot, and Kadarius Toney dropped a couple of passes, and there were more drops in week 1. So Detroit kind of got a pass there. And without those mental mistakes made by Seattle, Detroit lost this game. So I would look for Detroit to have a bounce back game. I do think that they'll be much better in week 3 than they were in week 2, but it's worth keeping an eye on whether or not their defense is able to respond to adversity mid-game, because that's been a pretty consistent knock on Aaron Glenn, and it does look like that is carried over into this season. With the outlook for the Seattle Seahawks, they did come away with the dub. They are 1-1 now. So Seattle looked better overall. Again, they got the win. So this was a good game for Seattle. This was a learning opportunity for the Lions. And we'll look forward to week 3 for both of these teams to kind of see what they're able to do with this. Moving on to my most important game of the week. It wasn't necessarily the best game of the week, but it is the most important game of the week to me. It was the Indianapolis Colts versus the Houston Texans. And before I really break down any sort of the stats or anything for this game, just know one thing. I've seen so much hate online for the Texans. I've seen so many people calling for D'Amico Ryan's head already. I've seen a lot of people complaining that, Stroud's just another Ohio State quarterback and isn't going to be able to do it, in the big way. But with all of that noise, people just need to give them time. CJ Stroud has been fantastic. We were running on a second string left tackle. We're on a second string left guard. We're on a third string center. And we're on a second string right tackle that got hurt and moved into a third string right tackle during this game. So no matter what anybody is saying about the Houston Texans, there is nothing but optimism for this team. Everybody should be excited about what we are seeing. We have seen more good play by this offense and this defense. Again, this defense got flamed real bad as well following this game. But we have seen more optimistic gameplay from both the offense and the defense from Houston this season than we have seen in years. You know, despite that offensive line, CJ Stroud went 30 of 47 for 384 yards and 2 touchdowns. He had no picks. He was sacked 6 times. He was pressured 3 times that amount. You know, our run game never got going because how could they? Our offensive line is made out of glass, and our offensive line has not played well. However, on the few plays that our offensive line is putting in a half decent play, you know, our offense is clicking. So again, no matter what noise is going on, the Houston Texans look so much better than they have previously, and people should be more excited than they are upset that we are 0-2. There's no reason to be upset. We were never meant to win these games. As soon as these offensive linemen started going down, the first thought in everybody's head should have been, this was a learning season anyways. We have so many young players on this team, and we have a first-time head coach. We have a first-time OC. We have all these new people. We have a brand new defensive coordinator in Matt Burke. Like it's one of those things where you can only overcome so much, and there's not a quarterback in the NFL that would have won this game with the offensive line play that Houston had. So you have all of these things. Damian Pierce and Devin Singletary. Did they get anything going? No. Devin Singletary got 1 or 2 really nice first downs that extended some drives. Damian Pierce was running like a bat out of hell. It just didn't matter because our offensive line couldn't block. Same thing with Stroud. Stroud's not putting up these crazy scoring drives because how could he? He's running for his life on every single play, and he's making the throws. He looks fantastic. I would look for Houston to be a legitimate player next season. And this whole year should be viewed as a developmental year for the entire team of the Houston Texans. And people should be more optimistic than not for what they are seeing on the field. The product has been good. We saw Nico Collins go over the century mark. He had 7 catches on 9 targets for 146 and a touchdown. That's a career high stat line for Nico Collins. Nico seems to have an interesting chemistry with CJ Stroud, and that really is CJ's favorite target. So you gotta love that. Robert Woods had a big game, 6 receptions on 9 targets for 74 yards for an aged Robert Woods. Like, he was getting open. Again, Stroud doesn't have the time to complete all these big passes. So the fact that we have this it's insane almost. Tank Dell, 7 catches for 72 yards on 10 targets and a touchdown. Massive stat line for rookie Tank Dell out of the University of Houston. You would like to see Dalton Schultz get more involved. I've never seen a Texans offense be so anti-tight end, for a lack of better way of putting it. You know, Dalton Schultz, he had 7 targets, only 4 catches. Brevin Jordan had 2 targets, only 2 catches. That's 100% catch rate. But again, 9 total targets between our tight ends in a game where CJ Stroud was getting pummeled every play. You would like to see a little more of the tight ends involvement. However, that I can't complain about that whatsoever. You know, our receivers, our starting 3 receivers put up such great stat lines that as much as I would like to see the tight ends more involved, I'd rather the receivers be the ones that are getting it because they're doing it efficiently. And with a drum roll, John Mechie finally returned to the field. Did he have a great stat line? No, he had 1 target, 1 catch for 17 yards, but John Mechie is freaking back, man. And as a Texans fan, it is so hard not to be excited for him, because if John Mechie can put together any sort of play this season, he is a shoo-in for comeback player of the year. And he's a player that was fantastic at Alabama. and could definitely create that extra edge that Houston needs in their receiving core, right? He could easily supplant Robert Woods going into next season or the year after that, depending on if we cut bait on Robert Woods early or not. So it's promising to see that Mechie was able to find the field in week 2. That's really early. He's coming off of leukemia. Like, what a feel-good story to have John Mechie back in the fold. And on a team that seems to be more focused on passing than running, that's great. I like John Mechie in college. I think John Mechie can be a star for the Houston Texans. Naturally, he's going to be on a pitch count. Naturally, he's not going to be in, perfect game shape week 2 of his first season back since beating cancer. But having him out on the field, I think really, really motivated the rest of the team. Did we get a dub? No, but I do think that Mechie being on the field and getting back into the fold of things is going to be really, really, really good for us moving forward. Talking about the defense, we were missing both starting safeties and Jalen Petrie and Jimmy Ward. That was a massive hit going into the game. I've been very vocal against Eric Murray since we signed him. We started the game with Eric Murray and MJ Stewart. Eric Murray even ended up getting hurt. So it looked on paper, and if you listen to my gambling show that I put out, I even took the Colts to win. They were +1. I took the Colts to cover this game, and they did because the leaders of our defense weren't there. Sure, we had Will Anderson, we had Denzel Perryman, but not having your anchors on the back end is a massive, massive blow to your team, and it's a very hard one to overcome. And then when your backup safety also gets injured, it is not easy to overcome that, and we didn't. Our defense got cooked. Our defense looked like the leader of our defense wasn't out there. They were having trouble relaying plays to one another. And the confusion is really what bit Houston's defense in the butt to begin with, right? The Colts ran out to a 14-0 start. Anthony Richardson looked like a stud. And the plays that he scored on, our entire defense looked like it was out of position. And that really boils down to Jimmy Ward and Jalen Petrie not being there to really call out the defense and put everybody in the position that they needed to be in for a successful play, right? It's not a huge knock on the personnel that we had in. It's next man up. This is the NFL, any given Sunday. But you can only overcome so much, and that was not something that we could overcome. Did our defense look good? No, they didn't. Nobody on our defense looked good. Is there still room for optimism? Yes. And I do believe that more or less boils down to the fact that the Colts ran out to an early massive lead. CJ Stroud lost that fumble on the second drive. And it's just one of those things where, you can only overcome so much. And I think that early impending doom sank in. And we tried too hard to overcome it and ended up failing in the end. So it's one of these things where we have so many young players on our team. We've had so many injury problems that again, this is a growing year. We've had enough issues so that we're working in depth in places that we shouldn't be working depth in games that actually matter. So the fact that we were able to keep this somewhat competitive, the fact that Stroud was able to almost bring us into a point where we were contending at the end of the game, it says something for the composure of our coaches. It says something for the composure of our depth. And there were bright spots, right? For a second week in a row, Denzel Perryman looks like one of the steals of the offseason. Henry To'oTo'o has been really, really good for us. Tavier Thomas has been very good for us. Derek Stingley doesn't look bad. He left the field with an injury at one point in the game. But again, he looks good. Last season, it was him v. Sauce, right? And Sauce, again, has looked better than Derek Stingley has, but Derek Stingley has looked really good in his own right. Will Anderson got a quarterback hit. He was not able to have the sack that he did in week 1, but you can't expect him to get one in every game. And especially with Anthony Richardson being in for the first half before he got pulled for the concussion, to run first team, the sack options are very limited. And then in the second half, when Gardner Minshew came in, nobody talks about the fact that the Colts offensive line is very underrated. And then 2, Gardner Minshew is a proven veteran at this point, so he knows when to get rid of the ball. There were no surprise sacks. So when you have an efficient leader under center, it's hard for the opposing defense to really, catch them off guard Jonathan Grenard didn't have near the game that he had in week 1. Malik Collins didn't have a great game. Jerry Hughes has not been fantastic for us. Sheldon Rankins has been nice. That was a good pickup. But again, as a cumulative effort, the defense just wasn't what it could be because we were missing the anchors of our defense. On the flip side, I've got to talk on the Colts, and I'm going to gush about the Colts a little bit despite them being division rivals because the Colts looked really good. Anthony Richardson has been surprisingly good early on. Is he an efficient passer yet? No. Is he hitting throws? Yes. Before he got pulled for the concussion, he hit quite a few decent throws. I mean, he was 6 for 10 for 56 yards, so take that with a grain of salt, right? It's not like he was lighting us up with his arm talent, but he's making the throws that he has to make, and that bodes well for a team that drafted a developmental prospect, arguably too high in the draft. So Anthony Richardson has looked really well in the time that he has played. The caveat to that being Anthony Richardson has now gotten hurt in each of the last 2 games, and it's starting to look like his usage of his legs is more detrimental to the team than it is helpful, because the best ability is availability, right? And luckily for the Colts, they have Gardner at the second quarterback slot, who is arguably the best quarterback in the NFL and probably could be starting for a handful of teams right now. So the fact that Gardner was able to come in and go 19 for 23 for 171 and a touchdown with a QBR of 90.9, that's great. That looks good for the Colts. The Colts look like they're going to be a little better than I thought they were going to be coming out of the offseason. And it's good for the NFL. Parity is a good thing. It's good when every team plays better every year, because eventually you're going to reach that peak where teams just look good and every week's a good matchup versus, when a specific team plays, you're like, they're going to get drove into the ground. There's not even any point in watching this, right? So admittedly, most of the continental United States probably thinks that about the entire AFC South. This probably was not a largely watched game in terms of bulk of viewers, but it was a good game for both sides. We got to see the Colts' underrated defense, just like their offensive line. Their defense looks fantastic. And the only reason that they're underrated is because they've taken some knocks, by the media, but the Colts defense looked polished. They've looked really good in both weeks so far. They lost their first game, but the defense looks pretty decent. It looks like they're starting to gel pretty well together, and it's good for the Colts. Their run game was clicking. Houston's run defense has been a problem for the last, 6 years straight. So it was a little disheartening to see us look so bad against the run against the Colts, especially against Zach Moss, which, no offense to Zach Moss, but isn't a star running back. But Zach Moss had 18 for 88 and a touchdown. His longest carry only went for 11 yards, which that's nice. But again, the Texans have to do better against the run, because if we're doing better against the run, Anthony Richardson probably doesn't score one of those running touchdowns to open it up 14-0. And B, we're able to control more of the tempo going through the game. Maybe our offense gets a bit more time out on the field. Perhaps the Texans are able to score more points. Maybe we're able to be a little more competitive. Maybe we're able to be in this game a little more than we were. But it's all hearsay because we weren't. We weren't good against the run game, and Zach Moss ran all over us. Anthony Richardson, again, 3 carries for 35, and he had the 2 touchdowns, which was an amazing stat line while he was in the game because he was only in the game for a couple of minutes. The Colts receivers leave a little bit to be desired. Thank goodness that they didn't torch us as well. But I would expect the receiving core for the Colts to be their biggest downfall moving through the season. I like Michael Pittman Jr. I don't think Michael Pittman Jr. is a star wide receiver. I don't think he ever will be. He's a great wide receiver 2. He's being used as a wide receiver 1 by the Colts. And he had 8 catches on 12 targets for 56 yards. That's not good. And that a lot of this, what I'm about to say, boils back to the Texans defense being better than advertised. Should they have played a better game? Sure. But they played pretty freaking good considering the circumstances. And when you have Pittman having only 56 yards on 12 targets, you have Will Mallory, who is a tight end that I didn't know who he was until this week. But you have Will Mallory coming in having 2 catches for 49. Josh Downs had 4 for 37. Alec Pierce was 2 for 28. Zach Moss was 4 for 19. There's a trend here, right? The Colts receivers were not getting yards after the catch. The tackling was good, and that's a testament to what D'Amico has been able to do with our defense, with the Texans defense. However, the Colts were better. The Colts were better in all 3 phases of the game. It doesn't matter how you try to spin it. The Colts defense, the Colts offense, the Colts special teams, they all played really well against Houston. It's a division game. It's a rivalry game to a point. So it makes sense. But, it has to be said that if the Texans weren't playing behind a patchwork offensive line, and if the Texans weren't missing their 2 safety anchors on defense, we probably win the first 2 games this season. Stroud has kept us competitive enough that we should have won the first 2 games. So again, going back to how I started this one, everybody who is a fan of the Houston Texans, maybe not the Dallas Cowboys, right, whom I'll talk about in a bit, but everybody who's a fan of the Houston Texans should be optimistic about this team moving forward, because once we get healthy, this team could really make something happen. And, as a Houston fan, as a diehard homer, this is awesome. I love this game. We lost. I was upset about that, just like everybody else. But again, there is room for improvement, and there is so much optimism surrounding this team because despite the losses, we are losing better than we have in previous years. And I love that for Houston. I love that for the fans of Houston. And I love that for all the players that we've brought in that really seem to be buying into D'Amico Ryan's system. Just a side note, since I did just cover them, I just got a report from ESPN that CJ Gardner-Johnson, or CJGJ for the Detroit Lions, is feared to have torn his pectoral muscle. And that is going to be a massive blow to the Lions secondary. So with all the things that I said about the Lions secondary, they may have just taken a small step back. And now Aaron Glenn's actually going to have a more difficult job moving forward because their giant offseason acquisition, the guy who's been the best corner on that team so far this season, may be gone for the rest of the year. Moving forward, the next game up is going to be the San Francisco 49ers and the LA Rams. The Los Angeles Rams have really impressed me this season. I wasn't very hopeful for them going into the season. Cooper Kupp's on injured reserve. They don't have a run game. I didn't know any of their receivers outside of Kupp. Their defense has been pretty historically good, but they're getting older. They've ever since they loaded their team up with veterans to make a shoot for the Super Bowl. They won a Super Bowl, and then after that happens, you're supposed to enter a rebuilding period, and maybe not be as good. The Rams have been very good. If you listen to the gambling show that I put out, I did take the Rams to cover +7. They did not cover. However, they didn't cover because of a couple of small mistakes at the end of the game, and they were in this the entire time. They gave the 49ers a run for their money all the way up until the end. Brock Purdy is amazing. Dude is super efficient. He's better than I could have ever expected him to be coming off of the injury. CMC, again, just like I said last week, Christian McCaffrey looks so happy playing for the 49ers. Kyle Shanahan's offense is perfect for Christian McCaffrey. And the only other person happier for Christian McCaffrey is Deebo Samuel, because Deebo Samuel no longer has to be used as that primo gadget player. He's not getting paid wide receiver and running back money. And that was a whole big thing for him, was that he was only being paid to be wide receiver. He didn't want to carry the ball 15 times a game while also getting 10 receptions a game. And CMC has taken a huge load off of Deebo. Now Deebo's a happier player. Christian McCaffrey is having the time of his life. And the 49ers are just a well-oiled machine. Despite the Rams taking them to the brink with virtually no-name players, the 49ers are the team to beat in the NFC. The Dallas Cowboys are 1B to that, right? And I'll touch on that here briefly in a moment. But the 49ers are playing perfect football right now. They only won by 7. The final score was 30-23. The Rams had a shot at the very end of the game that they ended up squandering. However, the 49ers are playing perfect football. Brock Purdy is managing the game as good as anybody. He didn't have a touchdown this game, but it genuinely didn't matter. That defense is insane. Their run game is very, very, very good. So it's one of these things where the 49ers are doing whatever they have to do to win games week in and week out. They don't have to focus on any one player. They don't have any divas on their team that are just begging for more receptions, right? You've never seen Deebo Samuel come out after like post-game interview and be like, yeah, I'm not getting the targets that I want. I don't have the receptions that I'm wanting. They're not throwing it to me in space. You don't get any of that, right? So it really seems like the 49ers are clicking in a way that, they were last year with Brock Purdy, but now they're healthy. And the 49ers are the team to beat. I think that the 49ers are the best team in the NFC, which is going to be a pretty controversial call considering how good the Cowboys have been. But the 49ers are doing the same thing the Cowboys are doing against better talent. So I really like what the 49ers were able to do. I'm going to move pretty quickly through this one because there's not a whole lot you can say. They are playing very efficient football. They're not turning the ball over, and their defense is absolutely punishing opposing offenses. Whereas on the flip side, Matt Stafford's having to do a little too much. I know Cam Akers is on the trade block, and if y'all don't, Cam Akers is on the trade block. That's already been released. And he's on the trade block because they had Kyron Williams come in and he's playing well enough to move Cam Akers. I would look for the Rams to probably take a running back in rounds 2 or 3 in this draft coming up. But it's one of these things where they're relying on an aged Matthew Stafford to make all of these throws. Matt Stafford had 55 completion attempts or passing attempts. So it's one of these things where admittedly the run game's not as good as they would like it to be, but with them being as close in this game as they were, you would think that they would have run the ball more. And just like I said with Seattle, it almost feels like the Rams don't trust their run game, which is something that plagued them last season. So I like that Kyron Williams has come in and unseated Cam Akers and made him expendable considering Cam Akers has been unreliable in terms of injuries. But you would like to see better output from the Rams. I mean, Matt Stafford was their leading rusher well into the second quarter. At the end of the game, he was their second leading rusher. Matt Stafford's ancient in terms of the NFL. So that's not something you want from your older veteran quarterback. That should never be a thing unless you only have 2 runners all game, and that's not the case. Stafford did manage to throw 2 picks. One of them sealed the game at the very end. Could he have played better? Yes. Are they relying too heavily on Matthew Stafford with the personnel that he has been provided? Yes. I like this Puka Nacua guy. He broke the record for the Rams for most receptions by a rookie in the first 2 games of their career. That's fantastic. He has been playing lights out. He had 15 catches on 20 targets for 147. So once Cooper comes back, that dude's going to be lethal, right? No longer can you double him and let Cooper Kupp go. Cooper's going to eat more of the coverage than Puka is. And it's really going to open this offense up. But until Cooper Kupp comes back, you need a third. Tutu Atwell, again, had a really good game. He had 7 catches for 77 yards. These are 2 people that nobody thought were going to be studs, especially not in, you hate to use it, but in a fantasy perspective, the Rams wide receivers have been really nice to people so far this season. And it was very it wasn't expected. It was very unexpected for the players that are playing well to be playing well. But outside of them, right, Kyron Williams did a lot for the receiving game. He had 6 catches for 48 and a touchdown. So add that to what he was able to do. And that really spells why Cam Akers is on the trade block. But behind him, Tyler Higbee, their big time tight end, had 3 catches for 12 yards. That was negligible. Ben Skoranek had 1 catch for 10. Van Jefferson, whom I thought was going to end up being a much larger part of this offense, had 1 for 9. Looks like Van Jefferson's probably going to be on his way out of LA after this season, or at least after next. So it's the Rams have become, they're not one dimensional, but they're not putting up the numbers that they need to beat the heavy hitters like the San Francisco 49ers. And it showed. Admittedly, the 49ers have the best defense in the league on paper, but the Rams needed more than what they got. Are the Rams geared to beat teams like the 49ers? What they'll tell you is yes, but after the Super Bowl, they've had to cut costs. They ran into a bunch of financial problems with cap hits. So this is kind of the best that they can roll out right now. So it is more of a soft rebuild, and we're going to see how far Matt Stafford can carry a season. But they've looked really promising. They're 1-1. They're tied for second place in the division behind the 49ers. And I would look for the Rams to be a contender this year. The Rams have looked good. I can't emphasize that enough. Matty Stafford has played really, really well. These two receivers in Puka and Tutu Atwell have played incredibly well. This new running back in Kyron Williams has played really well. So it's, despite the 49ers being so glowingly good, do not discount the fact that the Rams themselves are also very good. And it's going to make for a really fun season for both of these teams because they're in the same division and because they are in the NFC that doesn't necessarily have the level of competition that the AFC does, right? The NFC doesn't have as many teams that are as good as the AFC. And if the Rams are able to climb that ladder and become one of those teams, that's great for football and that's great for you and I as the consumer. So I'm here for it. Speaking of teams that have come out and played a lot better than people really expected them to, the Baltimore Ravens have been fantastic. Next game that I'm going to cover is the Ravens versus the Bengals. And despite me personally thinking that the Ravens were going to have a really good year, that was not the general consensus amongst the media. And the Ravens have played really well. The Ravens played incredibly well against the Bengals. The Bengals came out and said that Joe Burrow tweaked his calf and, they might be shelving him. And if that's the fact, then the Bengals are taking a huge step back this season, probably won't compete for the playoffs. If they lose Joe Burrow for 4 weeks, it's going to be a tricky season for the Bengals. But Joe Burrow did not have a good game. He didn't get going until the second half, whereas Lamar Jackson looked unstoppable all game, both through the air and on the ground. Gus Edwards has really shown up and shown out as the running RB1 after J.K. Dobbins got hurt. You have Justice Hill, who has looked really good, their third string running back. And just like we've been able to say for the last couple of years, the Ravens have a group of running backs that could all be starters for other teams in their own respects. So it is nice to see that both Justice Hill and Gus Edwards are running the ball well, because the Ravens seem to acquire a lot of injuries at running back. That does seem to be something that happens year in and year out. And having that next man up that can really come in and do something for you, especially having two that can come in and split the carries rather evenly. Gus Edwards had 10 carries for 62. Justice Hill had 11 for 41. Having two running backs that can come in and give you that sort of production is nice. Lamar Jackson had 12 for 54. Again, unstoppable both through the air and on the ground. But it's worth noting that the running back situation was questionable following the J.K. Dobbins injury. He's out for the year. And it seems that they have filled that gap pretty no problem. And that does look good for the Ravens. Through the air, Lamar was able to really spread this ball around and get everybody on that offense involved. Odell Beckham did get hurt. He had an ankle injury. He ended up leaving the game. T's and P's to Odell Beckham. I know, at least me personally, I really wanted Odell to have a decent season with the Ravens. I liked him being signed there, and I like Odell. He may be flashy. He may showboat too much, but he's like a less physical version of Terrell Owens. And he's good for the game because he's fun to watch, man. It's fun to watch him jaw. It's fun to watch the one-handed catches. Odell Beckham, at least at his prime, was really good for the NFL. But what's really good for the Baltimore Ravens is rookie Zay Flowers. I have Zay Flowers in 2 of my fantasy leagues, and he's owned in every league that I have been attached to, whether I helped somebody draft or whether it is other, the leagues that I am in. Zay Flowers has come on strong in his rookie year already, 2 weeks in. And with the injury to Odell Beckham, I would look for Zay Flowers to be even more productive moving forward. Nelson Aguilar put his stamp on the game. I like to see that. I liked Aguilar with the Eagles. I wish that he would have been able to produce more there. I liked Aguilar with the Raiders. I wish that he were able to produce more there. But it does seem like he may have found a home with the Baltimore Ravens, and they needed all the help at wide receiver they could get. So I love that for Lamar Jackson, right? It's nice having these receivers come in and play better for Baltimore than what they have had in the past while they were seemingly let go from their teams because they weren't good enough there. So it's nice to see that receivers are reviving their career with Lamar Jackson versus coming to Baltimore and having bad seasons. Because the wide receiver position has been a huge question mark since they drafted Hollywood Brown a couple years back. So this has been nice. Not to mention, Mark Andrews is a stud. I love Mark Andrews. If he can stay healthy, he's a top 3 tight end in the league. He did get involved in this game. He had a touchdown. He had 5 catches for 45 on 8 targets. So the Baltimore offense looks really, really good. Their defense also looks really good. The score was a lot closer than the game actually was. The Bengals ended up closing that gap a little bit in garbage time at the end of the game. But the Baltimore defense, despite the injuries that they have sustained, despite the fact that Roquan Smith never really got going until the second half, despite the fact that their pass rush hasn't been what was maybe as advertised going into the season, their defense looked really, really good. You know, Kyle Hamilton is starting to really settle in at safety. You know, Jadeveon Clowney, the longer Jadeveon's in Baltimore, the better he is going to be with this defense and the more run support he's going to be able to provide. You have Patrick Queen and Roquan Smith, both top tier middle linebackers for this Baltimore defense, and they're really starting to cook. Again, Roquan didn't have a great game week 2, but he didn't have to, right? If you're avoided, there's nothing you can do about it. And the big one for Baltimore was their patchwork secondary was able to hold Joe Burrow to a negligible amount of yards until the second half. That is what they really needed. You know, Marlon Humphreys got hurt early on, and that was a big hit. You know, they lost Marcus Peters, or they didn't re-up Marcus Peters. Marcus Peters is gone. So you have a newer crop of secondary players for Baltimore, namely like Ronald Darby, and they're able to come in and they are playing really, really good football right now. So it looks good for the Baltimore Ravens. You know, it seems that their offseason acquisitions are doing well. They're running on all cylinders right now. And props to the Baltimore Ravens, who are now 2-0. We might see a massive run by the Ravens again, and that would be awesome. I like Lamar Jackson. I hate this. He's a running back stuff because he's a good quarterback who has never had good wide receivers, and this might be the best receiving core that he has ever fielded. On the flip side of that coin, however, the Bengals defense outplayed its offense tenfold. The Bengals defense did look a whole lot better. Despite Lamar looking unstoppable, the Bengals defense outplayed their offense, and that isn't good, right? I get if Joe Burrow is hurt, but you've got to do more with the opportunities that you were given, and they got nothing going in the first half. One, Joe Mixon has not looked great this season so far. Joe Burrow has not looked good this season so far. Just, you know, he missed the preseason, so naturally he was going to look a little rusty, but this news that he may have retweaked his calf, I don't know what the Bengals are actually going to be able to do with this offense. And T. Higgins looked great. T. Higgins, as I talked about in my previous show, is slated to become a free agent because they're going to have to break off Jamar Chase after they broke off Joe Burrow. And he's basically playing as an audition for the other 31 teams in the NFL. And I can't say this louder from any larger of a mountaintop. Houston should really go out and sign T. Higgins. I know we have good wide receiver depth to a point, you know, quote unquote. And I really glow when I talk about the Texans wide receivers. T. Higgins is a stud. He had 8 for 89 and 2 touchdowns. He was the only receiver that even decided to show up against the Ravens. Tyler Boyd had a decent stat line with 6 for 52. Jamar Chase was a non-factor. Irv Smith, their tight end acquisition, was a non-factor. Joe Mixon did okay in the passing game. He went 4 for 36, but they needed him more to be better on the ground than they did through the air, right? And he couldn't provide that. So the Ravens were looking for this team to pass. The Ravens got up pretty high early, and it was one of those things where they were able to crimp down, and the Bengals really just weren't able to get anything going against the Ravens. And if I'm a Bengals fan, I'm panicking. You're 0-2 in a very tight division. The Browns are playing the Steelers right now, so it'll be one of these things where we'll see really where the Bengals are going to be ranked. But at 0-2, they're in the cellar. Right. And if Joe Burrow's hurt, the cellar's only going to get deeper. So if I'm a Bengals fan, or if I'm Zach Taylor, or if I'm anybody in the Bengals organization, 2 games in, I'm already going to start panicking because it doesn't look like anything better is on the horizon. Sure, they have a good offense, but their offensive line, just like the last couple of years, has question marks. It's almost like no matter how much money Cincinnati spends on their O-line, they are still not the best O-line in football, and they're not a top 10 O-line in football. And that is definitely getting to the point where it is becoming detrimental to the team. because Joe Burrow's hurt and Joe Burrow may have just gotten re-hurt. And behind him, you don't have a lot of confident depth at quarterback because how could you? You just paid your quarterback $275 million. So I am panicking with the Bengals. And I like the Ravens. I think the Ravens should run away with this division, especially after I just got a notification Deshaun Watson threw pick six to Alex Highsmith. I'm not able to watch this game until I watch the rerun of it after the show. But if the Browns end up losing to the Steelers, they're going to draw 1-1 with the Steelers. And Baltimore will sit atop of this division all alone. And Baltimore should be able to make a massive run. They do look like the best team in the AFC North right now. So props to them, right? This should be a great year for the Ravens. And it's starting to look like it's going to be a non-factor for the Bengals. Speaking of teams that you can potentially start to panic about a little bit, moving into the Chiefs and Jaguars game at Duval, the Jaguars decided not to show up whatsoever. Their offense didn't show up in any sort of way. Their defense had no answers. I mean, naturally, Chris Jones and Travis Kelce came back, and that's huge for the Chiefs, right? That's their two best players, not named Patrick Mahomes. But the Jaguars were not able to get anything going, which bodes well for the AFC South, right? AFC South is wide open, and Houston is still a player in the AFC South because of it. But you've got to worry about the offensive inefficiencies of the Jaguars. It was 6 passes caught in the back of the end zone that went out of bounds that didn't count. Calvin Ridley ran into a goalpost and almost got concussed. He didn't get launched into the concussion protocol, but he wasn't the same player after it. You're just not seeing what you expect, or at least I'm not seeing what I expected to see from the Jaguars. Travis Etienne was inefficient. He got nothing going on the ground. Trevor Lawrence was running for his life all game. He ate 4 sacks. He had 216 total yards on the day after 41 attempts. And it's a mishmash of things. Christian Kirk wasn't great week 1. Christian Kirk was the only receiver that showed up out of any of them for the Jags in week 2. Evan Ingram had a big game, and I can't overshadow that too much because I like the Evan Ingram signing there in Jacksonville, and it's good to see Evan Ingram getting going because I do think that he should be more of a fixture in this offense. But it still stands to reason. Calvin Ridley was the massive offseason acquisition. He had a terrific week 1. Calvin Ridley was a non-factor in week 2. Dearness Johnson, the backup running back, he was a non-factor in the receiving game. Jamal Agnew, the backup tight end, was a non-factor in the receiving game. Travis Etienne, who is a terrific pass catcher, was a non-factor in the passing game. And you just have to wonder, what are the Jaguars really trying to do? They did have the really nice trick play where Christian Kirk threw the pass. It could have been a huge play if things would have gone correctly for them. But it stands to reason, where was Jacksonville's offense? Historically speaking, Duval County is one of the hardest places to play. People go to Duval, like the Jaguars win ridiculous games at home. There are teams that come into Jacksonville that are projected to win by, umpteen points, 18 points, 14 points, 12 points. Like the betting lines have been wild. And Jacksonville can pull off these insane upsets because they play so well in Shad Khan Stadium that they can, maybe look better than what they normally do. And I thought that Jacksonville was going to run out to a 2-0 lead or to a 2-0 record after 2 weeks in the league. But the Chiefs really put together a much better performance than they did in week 1. And the Chiefs were the only team that showed up. Admittedly, Jacksonville's defense held the Chiefs to 17 total points. Jacksonville's defense looked really good. So in the offseason and in the preseason, the big thing around Jacksonville was that their offense was going to be historically good with what they have done, with whom they've brought in, with what they have built. Jacksonville's offense was supposed to be historically good. And they looked pretty solid in week 1, but took a massive step back in week 2 to a Chiefs defense that on paper isn't all that great. And even if you look at the Chiefs offense, like the numbers that they posted, the Jaguars should have been able to capitalize better than they did. And Trevor Lawrence squandered multiple drives. They were awful in the red zone. They ended up with 3 field goals, right? Because they just couldn't score a touchdown. And they got to the red zone. It was 4 or 5 attempts or 4 or 5 trips into the red zone that amounted to absolutely nothing. So you're not going to win games like that. And again, it's great for the Texans. It's great for the AFC South. But the Jaguars were really a team that I was hopeful for. And luckily it's early in the season and I'm sure they'll turn it around. Doug Peterson's a Super Bowl winning coach. The guy is really, really good at what he does, but you're going to want to see more out of an offense that was heavily touted as going to be one of the top 10 offenses in the league when they come out against a team that is going to be a player for the Super Bowl and they fall flat on their face. On the flip side of that, welcome back Travis Kelce. He had a great day. He had 4 catches for 26 on a touchdown on a pitch counts. Not bad for a tight end, right? And then you had Isaiah Pacheco, 12 carries for 70 yards. He didn't find the end zone, but he didn't have to. Patrick Mahomes did have to scramble a little bit. He had 7 for 30, and a lot of those, they weren't designed runs, and it was more of a coverage tuck and run versus he was getting chased for his life. But the Chiefs' offensive line could have played a little better, right? But they didn't. Again, they didn't need to. Sky Moore was open most of the game. He only had 3 catches on 4 targets, but he was open a bunch. He's looking a lot more exciting than he was week 1. Noah Gray, their backup tight end. Noah Gray looked really good. He had 3 for 38, but it's not the tail of the tape sings a different tune than his actual stat line. Kadarius Toney caught all 5 of his targets. They didn't go for many yards, but he caught all 5 of his targets after so many drops in week 1. Jerick McKinnon got involved in the receiving game with 3 for 24. It's one of these things where the Chiefs were efficient. The Chiefs looked like they watched film on the Jaguars, saw what they did well week 1, and then they broke the Jaguars. And the Jaguars just never got anything going. It is worth noting that Chris Jones was an absolute wrecking ball in his game back despite being on a pitch count. And I think that Chris Jones' involvement with the team moving forward is only going to grow. Do I think that he's going to be a free agent after this season? Yes, the Chiefs are out of money, and he is going to be the highest profile free agent in the league after this season. But while he's still there, I do believe that Chris Jones is going to give that defense the best chance to do something because he eats up so many blocks. He's so good, and he commands the center of the defensive line that other teams really have to, they have to scheme directly around him. And as we saw with the Jaguars, it's not the easiest thing to do because outside of him, the Chiefs do have some players on that defense that can make plays. So whenever the Chiefs offense is working as efficiently as it was against the Jaguars, you're going to have a lot of trouble winning games if you're not playing your best football. Because when their defense is well rested all game, because their offense is controlling the tempo of the game, you've got a steep hill to climb as the opposing team. That's not to really take away from what Jacksonville was able to do because it wasn't all bad for them. But the Jaguars couldn't get out of their own way and ended up costing them pretty big in the end because this was a very winnable game. Again, Kansas City only scored 17 points. Theoretically speaking, the Jaguars should have been able to overcome that, and they should have been able to make some adjustments to really stay in the game better than they were. Despite it being an 8-point loss, the game was the Chiefs won by a lot more than what they scored on paper, right? The Chiefs were just better, and the Jaguars are going to have to do a better job of preparing for the teams that are actually going to be heavy hitters in the league this season, the Chiefs being the best team in the AFC for the last few years running. So they're just going to have to do better. And another AFC South team that, last week, everybody was saying they've just got to be better. This is the end of an era for them. The Tennessee Titans came out and they beat the Los Angeles Chargers. And that was a crazy game. It went into overtime. This is not a game that I expected the Chargers to lose. I actually went 0-2 on my betting takes on the gambling pod strictly because Tennessee came out and played a game that I just didn't see coming. And they knocked the Jaguars off the crown for the AFC South. They were 0-1. Now they're 1-1. And there's a 3-way tie for first place in the AFC South with Houston being the only winless team. But coming off of this week 2 victory, Tennessee looks like they might actually be the best team in the AFC South after Indianapolis had a pretty shaky loss in week 1. And they did it being efficient with the football. Ryan Tannehill had a return to form, right? He didn't score a lot of points, but he went 20 of 24. And when Ryan Tannehill's hitting his passes, they are historically really good because just like they have historically speaking, Derrick Henry got off to a good start. And despite his yard per carry average of 3.2 yards, Derrick Henry looked really good, and he commanded the off. Like he commanded the way this game went. He was the captain in the chair, and he got to dictate really where this game went. Despite 25 for 80 yards and a touchdown, he looked really crisp in a year coming off of a year that he had an injury. He got hurt last year, and Derrick Henry has looked good this season, and that bodes well for the Titans. It also bodes well that Tyjae Spears, the young running back that they really hyped up in the offseason, is having a really good year backing Derrick Henry up. And when you have a kid that can come in and post 8 carries for 49 yards behind Derrick Henry and keep Derrick from getting some of those hits, like, you're going to extend his shelf life for the season. And if Derrick Henry stays healthy all year, and if Tyjae Spears stays healthy all year, and if Ryan Tannehill stays healthy all year, we might see more upsets like what we saw against the Chargers. And that's not to say nothing against the Titans here, but it does seem that the Chargers are really good at blowing leads to people, and they are really good at blowing games that they should win. See the Jacksonville playoff game last year. And you have to wonder what's going on with Los Angeles, because their defense has not looked good this year. They are 0-2. They are in the bottom of their division. And Justin Herbert's playing well. The offense is playing well. Granted, their run game was non-existent with Austin Eckler out this week. Joshua Kelly wasn't able to carry the run offense like I kind of thought he would. But the Chargers offense looked pretty good, all things considered. Keenan Allen, although aging a little bit, does not seem to be slowing down. He had 8 for 111 and 2 touchdowns. Mike Williams looked really good with 8 catches on 13 targets for 83 yards. They got Gerald Everett involved in the passing game with 3 for 47. So their passing game was clicking. I would have liked to have seen more Donald Parham, and I think more Donald Parham is something that we'll see more in the future. But their offense looked pretty decent, all things considered. It just boiled down to the fact that the Chargers' defense was terrible. And for a defensive-minded coach and Brandon Staley to come in and have a pretty stale defense, that is a telltale sign of things that you don't want, right? Like, again, it's early in the season, and they're definitely going to bounce back. The Chargers are definitely going to compete, I think. But being down 0-2, the only team in that division that I can really say that they are better than is the Raiders. And the Raiders have a better record, right? Even Denver was able to come back, and I'll talk about them here in a minute. But even Denver was able to not come back. They ended up blowing a huge lead, but Russ Wilson kept them in it. The Denver Broncos actually ended up with a very similar story to the Chargers, where they had an early lead, and then their defense just failed them in the second half. And what is perceived to be a lesser team was able to come in and get a dub that not everybody expected, myself included. And, naturally, I'm not a Titans fan. They stole the Oilers colors, quote unquote. The Steelers or the Oilers moved to Tennessee, but they stole the Oilers colors. All of my favorite Houston players go to Tennessee to die. And I am just not a Tennessee Titans fan. However, you've got to love what Tennessee was able to put together against the Chargers. Their defense played a very solid game. I would have liked to have seen a better pass rush out of Harold Landry now that he is back. But players like Danico Autry are looking like steals from the offseason. Taylor Tart has looked really good. Elijah Molden has looked really good this season. Roger McCreary looks really good this season. Kevin Byard is an all-pro safety, and he is playing like it again this season. I would have liked Arden Key to maybe do a little more with his snaps, but again, you're not going to win every matchup. And despite his lack of statistics, they were still able to, push the Chargers to the brink. They sent it to overtime, the Chargers sent it to overtime, and the Tennessee Titans were able to capitalize and run away with the dub. So this is going to be an interesting game towards the end of the season, because I do believe that this game had playoff implications. And if you see the Chargers miss the playoffs by one game, it wouldn't be the week 1 loss. It would be the loss to the Titans in week 2 that I would point to for the reason that the Chargers ended up losing the playoffs. And I don't mean to come off as, a salty fan or anything like that. I have no love for the Chargers outside of Justin Herbert coming from Oregon University being my favorite school in college football. But I would really would have liked to have seen the Chargers put up a better game, because there was no reason to lose to the Titans. The Titans aren't the best team in the AFC South, and the Chargers are a better team than the Tennessee Titans. So out of the biggest takeaway from this game is definitely going to be that the Los Angeles Chargers are going to end up having to put together a much better game plan, or they're going to get washed this season really, really quickly. And we might see Brandon Staley on the hot seat, right? That's definitely possible. We might see a few other changes. It's too early to note, but is this going to be the end of Keenan Allen, right? Like if the Chargers don't have a good season, do we see a changing of the guard? Do we see Keenan Allen leave the Chargers? Do we see Austin Eckler not get a big contract at the end of the year, despite the run game moving exclusively through him and Joshua Kelly not being that guy whenever Austin Eckler's not in? Do we see movement at the tight end position? If Donald Parham doesn't start putting together more complete games, do we see them bring in another tight end and have a tight end competition next season? Like there are all these variables, and you've got to wonder where they are going to go from here, because at 0-2, you can only go up unless you keep going down. And if the Chargers lose 2 more games, if they start the season 0-4, the season will be lost for the Chargers because the division that they play in. So when you play in the same division as the Chiefs, you really have to turn it up. And if the Chargers wait too long, they're not going to be big competitors in the AFC West like we all expected them to be. So this was an interesting game. As far as week 2 matchups go, this was a tough loss for the Chargers. This was a terrific win for the Titans. And it really looks like 2 teams that have a lot to work on that are moving in 2 entirely different directions at this point in the season. The next 2 games that I'm going to talk about, they're easy to group together because of the divisions that are being played against one another and what have you. But you have the Packers, Falcons, and the Bears and Buccaneers. And I'm grouping these together after the Chargers, Titans, because just like the Titans came as an underdog and they were able to beat the Chargers, the Falcons beat the Packers, did not see that coming. And the Buccaneers beat a Bears team that I myself really thought was going to be better this year. It turns out the Bears are dog water, right? It turns out the Bears are the worst team in the NFL. They are the ones tanking for Caleb Williams. We all got it wrong. Arizona's not the team that we thought they were going to be. They actually made some smart decisions, it turns out. Josh Dobbs has been great. But the Bears are very, very bad. And the Packers ended up losing a game that they probably shouldn't have lost to the Falcons. And props to Desmond Ridder, right? The Falcons played a game that I did not expect them to play to a point. The Packers were in control of this game for most of the game. It feels like the Packers organization, despite a very strong week 1 from Jordan Love against the Bears, whom, again, dog water, absolute trash. The Bears are so bad this season. But despite a Jordan Love performance against the Bears that was really good, the Packers were missing Aaron Jones, and it felt like they didn't trust Jordan Love to lead an offense that was then being led by A.J. Dillon, which was not the move. The Packers were very efficient in the first half. They looked very good. They had a nice lead, but the Falcons kept chipping away at it the entire game. They just would not go away. The Falcons were pestering them all game. And then in the second half, the Falcons defense flipped a switch that I didn't even think that Arthur Smith knew how to flip. And they were able to just stonewall the Packers. And Jordan Love didn't end up with that great of stats. He didn't throw for very many yards in the second half. He only ended up throwing for 151 total yards in the game. He didn't have a pick and he threw for 3 touchdowns, but he only completed 14 passes. And in a game as tightly contested as this was, without your star running back, I don't care how good you think A.J. Dillon is, when you're missing the components that you're missing, you have to let your quarterback air it out, kind of like the Falcons did. Desmond Ridder had 115 yards in week 1. He had 19 completions in week 2, but he had 237 yards. And their offense, despite moving through Bijan Robinson and Tyler Algier, their offense worked well in the passing game. And very similar to the Bears and Buccaneers, whereas the Bears, they do trust Justin Fields, unfortunately. But Justin Fields can't throw the ball, and Baker Mayfield for the Buccaneers was unstoppable. Baker had the best game that he's had in a good long while, and he finally looks like that first-round pick that he was all those years ago. Baker didn't get a fair shake with the Cleveland Browns. He was brought in. He had 4 different offensive coordinators in 4 years. The head coach changed almost every year. There was just so much turnover that Baker was never able to put together a solid season, more or less, outside of his rookie year. because there was so large of a lack of continuity that it would be hard for anybody to have really gelled with their team, right? And the Bears were just bad. They have no run game. They have no passing game. David Moore is good, or DJ Moore is good, but it doesn't matter. I feel so bad for him getting traded from Carolina because it just doesn't matter. Justin Fields is not a good quarterback. I sung his praises all offseason. I wanted him in all 3 of my fantasy leagues. Thank God I only got him in one of them. Justin Fields is a bad quarterback, and I would look for Chicago to start planning for a change at quarterback because he is not the one. Unless Justin Fields finds some sort of miracle hidden in a field somewhere soon, Justin Fields will not be the quarterback of the Bears for all that much longer because, again, I can't emphasize this enough, he is not a good quarterback. Whereas Baker was throwing lights out. Mike Evans had a terrific day with 6 catches for 171 and a touchdown. That new running back, Rashid White for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, has looked very good. He looked good in week 1. He looked good again in week 2 against the Bears, just like the Packers did. But the Packers, in their second game, were not near as effective. Again, Aaron Jones was out. A.J. Dillon is not Aaron Jones. A.J. Dillon looks like he might actually be a trade target. They might look to move A.J. Dillon for picks and or actual player compensation because it just doesn't look like he is a guy that can carry an offense. But the Packers offense, although it was efficient, right? It was efficient just like it was against the Bears. They weren't getting yards. They're getting plenty of completions for Jordan Love. Right? Like he did miss more passes than he did in week 1, but he's hitting his throws. He's just not hitting the ones that matter. They're bad at getting first downs. He's not getting pressured that much, but he's playing like he's afraid. And you just have to wonder, they gave Jordan Love that 1-year contract versus signing the 5th-year option. And you wonder if the Packers end up cutting bait on Jordan Love. I don't think they will. I do think Jordan ends up turning it around. He's looked pretty decent, and he's not turning the ball over, so there's certainly room for growth. But for them to choke this win off against the Falcons, it begs to wonder, where do we go from here? The leading receiver for the Packers only had 40 receiving yards. Admittedly, the leading receiver for the Falcons only had 67. But that's still more. And the Falcons had 2 receivers with over 60 yards and 2 with over 45 yards. And the Packers had no receivers do any of that. So you have to wonder, are they spreading the ball too much? No, that's not an accurate assessment. But are the Packers built to win? No. And this is what Aaron Rodgers' biggest complaint was when he was with the Packers, is that they didn't invest in skill players. And it's starting to manifest itself with Jordan Love, because he doesn't have that primo target that he can just trust and go to. They were down Christian Watson. That was a huge knock, but everybody kind of thought Romeo Doubs was going to come in and do a little better of a job. He didn't. So the Packers deserve to lose this game. This game it was only a 1-point game at the end of it, which is a testament to the Packers defense. But the Packers should have lost this game, and they did. And props to the Falcons, because the Falcons played a very good game. Desmond Ridder, just like Jordan Love, they are both younger quarterbacks who are coming in. Desmond Ridder being in his 2nd year, Jordan Love being in his 5th. But Ridder has looked good, since coming into the league last season. I do think Desmond Ridder might end up being halfway decent for the Falcons. He did throw a pick this week, and you don't like to see that. But it's going to happen, right? And at least he's pushing the ball down the field. The longest reception for the Falcons this week was 45 yards for Mac Hollins. 45 yards is not bad, right? At least Desmond Ridder is trying to stretch the field, and it worked. They capitalized. They ended up getting a dub out of it. And the big takeaway here is that the Packers look like they don't trust their offense if Aaron Jones isn't in. It looks like that Aaron Jones is the new Aaron Rodgers. Aaron Jones is what is massively important to this Packers offense. And if he were to miss any significant time, look for the Packers defense to have to carry that team. Whereas the big takeaway from the Falcons is that their defense can flip a switch and play as good as anybody. They can stop somebody entirely in the second half if they want to. And Bijan Robinson is a freaking stud, man. The big takeaway here is that Bijan had his big breakout game. He had 19 carries for 124 yards, and he looked good for every one of them. And then he also posted 4 catches on 5 targets for another 48 yards. So it looks like he is really starting to hit his stride. I am sad that we're not seeing any Cordero Patterson, right? I am a big Cordero Patterson fan. He was one of my favorite players as a kid with the Vikings, but it is promising to see the new young rookie running back in Bijan Robinson come in and really lead this offense and help alleviate some of the pressure off of Desmond Ridder, which Ridder, again, is still learning on the fly. He is getting better week by week. So having a run game that can really offset your passing game is fantastic. And then you have Drake London, who is their wide receiver one, who led the team in receiving yards, who led the team in receptions, who led the team in targets, just like it was meant to. You have Matt Collins, who came over from the Raiders, who was playing really well. You have Jonnu Smith from the Patriots, who had 4-on-6 targets for 47 yards. That's an interesting statistic just because Kyle Pitts didn't do that. You have to wonder whether, maybe the Falcons are going to prioritize Jonnu Smith courtesy of his pass blocking ability and his run block or his blocking ability in general, whereas Kyle Pitts is basically a massive slot receiver. But the Falcons have enough threats to compete with anybody. And I think that their defensive outing against the Packers is going to be very telling for the rest of the season. If the Falcons defense is able to put together some solid game plans, the Falcons could win some games that people don't expect them to. And those are really my big takeaways from that game. And I know I've been bouncing back and forth. So bouncing back to Chicago and Tampa, right? Tampa Bay's defense is pretty good. Chicago putting up 17 points on Tampa Bay's defense didn't look great, but they're gonna score points eventually, and they do have some uber talented people on that offense. It's just, I really don't think that the Bears win more than 4 games this season after all offseason. I was like, Justin Fields might win the MVP, right? I thought Justin Fields was going to play at an MVP level. I really did think that maybe giving him some wide receivers and a better offensive line would help. It hasn't. It doesn't help that getting rid of David Montgomery left a gaping hole at running back, right? Khalil Herbert played well last season. He should not have dethroned David Montgomery, but he did. And Khalil Herbert looked not too great in week 2. However, they left the run game really quickly. Tampa Bay got out to an early lead, and Chicago, doing as Chicago does, abandoned their run game arguably too early and put the entire game on Justin Fields' back. And as we've all seen, historically speaking so far, you can't do that because Justin Fields cannot carry a team. Justin Fields cannot throw balls downfield unless he hits his 1 or 2 lucky deep passes a game. So it's going to be a crazy year for the Chicago Bears. I feel bad for the Bears fans because it does look like the Bears might be the worst team in the league. And that's really saying something considering the Arizona Cardinals came out in the offseason and were actively tanking. I'm not going to speak too much more on this game. Tampa Bay had a great game. Chicago had a bad game. Chicago's a bad team. Tampa Bay looks like a much better team than I thought they were going to be. Tampa Bay's 2-0. Chicago is 0-2. I would look for Tampa Bay to be a pretty big player towards midseason because if Tampa Bay can put together some good game plans, Tampa Bay can win that division pretty easily. With the Saints being the only real veteran presence in the division. There's a lot of rebuilds going on in their division. So it stands that Tampa Bay could pretty easily go to the playoffs in their first year sans Tom Brady leaving, which is pretty interesting in and of itself. Before I wrap up these last couple of games that I have to go over for the week 2 games, it does appear that Nick Chubb broke his leg. It looks like a pretty gruesome injury. They wouldn't even show the replay on TV. So T's and P's out to Nick Chubb, whom I think is arguably the best, or was arguably the best running back in the NFL. It is incredibly unfortunate that has happened to the Browns. The Browns are leading the Steelers currently at the time of filming. They are up 9-7 right now. I did take the Browns to beat the Steelers. I took the Browns to cover on the gambling pod. Deshaun Watson has played remarkably bad. And it does seem that Nick Chubb is going to be out for the season. So it is going to be rough sledding ahead for the Cleveland Browns. But jumping back into it, the biggest surprise game of the week was the Giants versus the Cardinals. I'm not going to go over too much with this because we have all witnessed how bad the Giants have been, whether you watched week 1 or you watched week 2. The New York Giants are a terrible football organization this year. It seems that they have taken a massive step back courtesy of their offensive line woes. However, with that being said, Daniel Jones was able to stage a comeback, and in the true art of tanking, the Cardinals allowed the Giants to win by a field goal at the end of the game. Again, the Giants' offensive line looked putridly bad against a Cardinals team that honestly shouldn't be winning games or even be competitive in games. But Josh Dobbs is the coolest takeaway from the NFL 2 games into the season because he has been very, very good for an organization that is very bad. The Cardinals do not have the skill players to be good. The Cardinals do not have the defense to be good. And Josh Dobbs willed them to an early lead in a way that I would have never guessed. The Giants ended up coming back. You have an injury to Saquon Barkley. They think it's a high ankle sprain. He went in for an MRI. At least I haven't seen the update on that, so I don't necessarily know where that's going to go. I do know that he was hurt. I do know that it was at least originally listed as a high ankle sprain, but he did have an MRI today. If they lose Saquon, I don't think Saquon is going to be a Giant next year, which I don't think he's going to be a Giant anyways. But it is going to be a massive blow to the Giants offense that is already incredibly bad. The Giants wide receivers have not been good. Daniel Jones has not been good, and that is all on the offensive line. It's not that Danny Dimes is just throwing errant passes all over the place. It's just that the Giants offense is bad because Danny Dimes is running for his life more than any quarterback sans maybe CJ Stroud. So, again, I'm going to glaze over this game just because this was a bad game. The Cardinals did choke it off in the end. Cardinals were really bad in the fourth quarter and for about half the third quarter, mostly the second half. The Cardinals were really bad in the second half. Again, in the true art of tanking, you're not supposed to win games. So the Cardinals, in my opinion, probably schemed that into the game after a very surprise lead by Josh Dobbs. But it looks good for the Cardinals when, Josh Dobbs is playing good football for some reason. And then James Conner is playing out of his freaking mind. James Conner at running back has been pretty consistent. Throughout his career, he has had a lot of injury issues, but this year James Conner has looked pretty good. And Josh Dobbs he's really spreading the ball around, and it looks good for the Cardinals. It's going to be a hard tank, it looks like. Hollywood Brown is catching a bunch of passes. He's getting a lot of targets. Good for Hollywood. I know that Hollywood was a diva in Baltimore, and it's good that he's being used the way that he wants. Zach Ertz still looks good. He was good for Philadelphia. Zach Ertz is getting peppered with targets by Josh Dobbs. You have Michael Wilson and Trey McBride both getting peppered with targets by Josh Dobbs. I did expect Rondale Moore to be a bit more of the offense, but that could just be because Josh Dobbs has only been there for like 3.5 weeks, and these are just the players that he's really clicked with. So I don't expect the Cardinals to win very many games. I don't expect the Cardinals to be very competitive overall. They might hang in games with teams, but it does seem that they are tanking for Caleb Williams, and if they're not tanking for Caleb Williams, they're tanking for no reason. So it's going to be interesting to see what they end up doing going into next year. They could pursue Marvin Harrison Jr., which would be pretty cool if they decide to stick with Kyler Murray. I don't know if they end up sticking with Kyler Murray after the problems they've had with him and this season-ending injury that he has. But with that being said, the big takeaway from this game is that the Arizona Cardinals are better than advertised, and the Giants are just as bad as they were in Week 1 when they got blasted by the Cowboys. I don't care that they were able to peel off 31 points and win this game by a field goal. This game should have never gone the way that it did. Arizona never should have scored 28 points. The Giants should have never had to come back from behind. There never should have been a 14-0 deficit for the Giants in this game. So the Giants' offensive line is going to overshadow anything good that they have going on. I love that Darren Waller got involved. He had 6 of 8 for 76, and good for Darren Waller. But the Giants are not going to win a lot of games this year unless they figure out something with the offensive line, unless they swing a big trade at the deadline. Like, the Giants are just not going to win a lot of games this year, and beating the Cardinals by 3 points at the end of the game is going to be a huge testament to that. We are moving into the last 3 games of Week 2, sans the Monday night game going on during the time of filming. So jumping into the Jets versus the Cowboys, Aaron Rodgers being hurt is going to cripple the Jets. As much as I like Zach Wilson, and as much as I like that Zach Wilson's teammates are really being confident or really talking him up and they're defending him to the public, I think Zach Wilson is easily the second largest detriment to the team right now, next to the offensive line that ended up getting Aaron Rodgers hurt in the first place. The Jets could be good next season. I don't envision the Jets actually doing anything this year. They're already off to they're 1-1. But they're not as competitive as they could be, right? With the loss of Aaron Rodgers and the loss of that real offensive flair, the Jets just cannot score points with Zach Wilson. They didn't score a bunch of points against the Bills. They outlasted the Bills, and the Cowboys just beat the piss out of the Jets. The Cowboys were all over the field all game. They only scored 30 points, but the game could have been a lot worse if the Cowboys had kept their foot on the gas or if the Jets were actually scoring points. So this is another game where, I took the Cowboys over the Jets at -8.5. The Cowboys ended up feeding into that, no problem. I did take the under, and that blew by a 1.5, which was a bit disappointing. However, the Jets are not a good team right now. They just have no offensive consistency. The defense can play well. They did not play well against the Cowboys, but the defense is going to be good this year. The Cowboys are just better. As it stands right now, I have the Cowboys at 1B in the NFC to the 49ers alone, and it has an asterisk next to it because statistically they've been just as good. Micah Parsons is a stud, and it just feels like the Cowboys feel different than they have in years past. I always hate the fans that come out like, oh, this is all our year. Right? As a Texans fan, I hate the Cowboys. I hate everything to do with the Cowboys, and I've said that on this show more than once. But the Cowboys look really freaking good. So the big takeaway from this game is that, one, CeeDee Lamb can catch anything even if the ball is contested. Dak Prescott can still make all of the throws. Tony Pollard is a really, really good running back, and he is proving that week in and week out, at least through the first 2 weeks of the season. Deuce Vaughn is an incredible change of pace back, and DeMarcus Ware still has it. And the Cowboys defense as a whole is good enough to compete with anybody. So take away the fact that the Cowboys offense is playing lights out right now. Their defense is playing better. And that's really saying something considering the offense is playing efficiently and they are playing well. The Jets do have a lot of work to do. I hate what is happening to them just because it is kind of unfair that that Aaron Rodgers got hurt 4 plays into a season after this big workup towards, really what the Jets were going to be. And I think Robert Saleh is doing the best that he can to really do everything he can for the Jets. I think Nathaniel Hackett is trying his best to coach Zach Wilson into wins. I think Zach Wilson needs a little bit of a confidence boost, and they need to let him kind of air it out a little bit more because the run game's not always the answer despite having Dalvin Cook and Breece Hall. I think giving Breece Hall only 4 carries in this loss, considering the Jets only lost by 20 points, I think giving Breece Hall 4 carries in this game is a bit criminal. And I do think that Breece Hall gets significantly more involved in games to come. And the Jets are going to win more games. They're still going to be a decent team. I just don't think that they're going to be a strong competitor by the end of the season. I think the Jets are going to forfeit the rights to potentially be the division leader to the Miami Dolphins and the Buffalo Bills. And I think that this season is just going to be more of a we need to recover from what we lost versus, the high of potentially striving for a Super Bowl. Would I like to be wrong here? Yes, I do like the Jets, and I do like Zach Wilson, and I do think that the Jets could be good. I just really think that they have more questions than answers, and that's going to end up being the downfall of the Jets this season. Last 2 games of the slate were 2 of the, in my opinion, better games. The Commanders v. Broncos was another game like the Tennessee Titans game where the Broncos probably shouldn't have lost this game, but I think the Commanders are going to prove a lot of people wrong this year. I like Riverboat Ron. I really hope he doesn't end up on the hot seat, but I also like Jeff Fisher a lot, and that dude was always on the hot seat. All right, I have really bad taste in coaches outside of D'Amico Ryans, and I do like good coaches, but Ron Rivera has been a very up and down coach throughout his coaching career as a head coach in the NFL. He did have Cam Newton, and they had all those years where Cam Newton was at the top of the game. But with the Commanders, it's been pretty wishy-washy. And I like that the Sam Howell has been able to come in, and despite taking the media, ESPN labeled him as a sack magnet, and he is very good at finding his way into sacks. But Sam Howell put together a hell of a game against the Broncos, despite the Broncos coming out to an early lead. The Broncos absolutely choked. That, as much as I would like to credit Washington with just a terrific game plan, it was more of a Broncos choke than it was a Washington Commanders, enlightening victory. With that being said, I mean, the Broncos have a lot of deficiencies. Russell Wilson played lights out. He looked like he did back in his heydays with Seattle. He led the team in run yards. He had 6 carries for 56 yards. He had a pretty decent day through the air with 18 for 32 for 308 and 3 touchdowns. He also threw a pick. And a lot of those yards came off of a last-second Hail Mary at the end of the game where they tried to tie it with a 2-point conversion and potentially failed on a missed pass interference call. Neither here nor there. Again, I don't like hammering down on the refs because it doesn't make any sense to do so because they're not permanent officiators. And, we see a lot of this year in and year out. So losing by a 2-point conversion with a potential missed pass interference falls more on the lack of production in the second half by the Broncos than it does the referee crew. With that being said, Brian Robinson looked really good running the ball. Sam Howell was effective through the air. He went 27 for 39 for 299, 2 touchdowns and no picks. He did get sacked 4 times, but Sam Howell had a really good game. Scary Terry looks good. I really wish that I wish they had a better quarterback. Not a slide on Sam Howell. I wish Washington had a better quarterback because I think Terry McLaurin could pretty easily be a Hall of Fame wide receiver if he had somebody half decent throwing to him for a bulk of his career. But, we'll see how this ends up playing out. I do think Terry ends up in Washington for a long time. I do think Sam Howell could end up being a really good quarterback for them. It's going to be it's a building year. Washington spread the ball around quite a bit, but you had 6 targets to Scary Terry. You had 5 targets to John Bates, and then the rest of the team averaged 3 targets. Jahan Dotson did not get involved in this game despite the victory. So there's room for improvement for Washington. And again, Denver choked this game off more than Washington led their way to victory. But Washington's 2-0. Denver is 0-2. So, the maths, right? Denver should have lost this game. I do like that Marvin Mims Jr. is doing something for the Broncos, sort of. He only had 2 targets, but he had 2 catches for 113 and a touchdown. Denver's entire receiving core got hurt in the offseason. Tim Patrick is gone for the season. Cortland Sutton has been pretty decent this year, but Jerry Jeudy's coming off of an injury. You have Greg Dulcich, the tight end for Denver. He was out with an injury. And they're just marred with skill player injuries that is really leading to this Broncos team where Russell Wilson just doesn't have a lot to work with. Again, Cortland Sutton played, Jerry Jeudy played, but Jerry Jeudy has a hamstring injury. And they didn't have a run game to speak of. Javonte Williams didn't get enough carries. And he didn't do a whole lot with the carries that he got, right? He had 12 carries for 44 yards, has a 3.7 yards per carry average in week 2. So just like I've stated prior in other games, you kind of have to have that run game to offset your passing game, especially when you're missing so many skill players at the receiver position. So it stands to reason that, the Denver Broncos lost this game more because of injuries than anything else, which attributes to the choke that they had at the end of the game. There just isn't that big guy that Russell Wilson can really trust and go to in the pivotal moments, and that is showing, right? And because of that, Denver is now 0-2. The big takeaways from this game is that the Commanders might be better than we expect. Are they better than Dallas? No. Are they better than Philadelphia? Also, no. But Washington could be better than what we've seen in years past, and that's great for them. It's great for Riverboat Ron, or Ron Rivera, their head coach. And it's just one of these things where Washington is transitioning into a better team, and we are watching that transition in real time. I would like to see Curtis Samuel get more involved in their offense, whether it's the run game like a Deebo Samuel package or in the passing game. But if you don't fix what's not broken. So Washington is 2-0. They've won every game so far in the reg. So I can't complain too much about what they've done with their schemes. That's just kind of something that I personally would like to see as a fan of Curtis Samuel coming out of Carolina. So moving into the final game of the Postcap that I am doing now, it's going to be the Miami Dolphins and the New England Patriots. I think this game ended up being a whole hell of a lot closer than a lot of the fans expected it to be. The correspondent that was on my show a couple of episodes ago, Joey, thought this was going to just be a massive blowout. And I mean, in respect to him, Miami did control this entire game, but it was a blowout by no means. New England is very good at a few things, and one of those is really taking away what teams do best, And you saw that with the lack of deep balls to Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill. They really were able to contain the passing game of Tua. Although Tua had a decent game, the Patriots were able to contain that passing game enough to stay in this. The biggest takeaway from this game and the week before it is that Mac Jones does not play good football until the second half, and that's not going to win the Patriots any games. At the end of the day, that is not going to win any games. Ramondre Stevenson is a good running back. He ended up having a good game. You see the lack of skill position players for the Patriots. They don't have that big number one wide receiver. Devontae Parker had a decent game. Hunter Henry had a decent game. Mike Gesicki had a decent game. But you don't have anything beyond that. Kendrick Bourne didn't find the end zone. Juju Smith-Schuster was a non-factor for a second game in a row. So you have this paradox with the Patriots, where it's just like they were when Tom Brady was there, but it's not, right? Like, they just don't have the skill players to compete with the good teams, but Bill Belichick is such a wizard with that defense that they're able to be competitive. If they could get Mac Jones to play worth a shit in the first half of these games, the Patriots could potentially be 2-0. They could have knocked the Eagles off. They could have beaten the Dolphins, but instead they lost both games because they don't get hot until midway through the third quarter, and now they are 0-2 because of it. In terms of fantasy projections, I wouldn't trust Devontae Parker. He's been hurt a lot. I wouldn't trust Hunter Henry. He's been hurt a lot. Kendrick Bourne is 28 and he's not putting together consistent games already. So the Patriots are a bit, again, of a paradox where you don't know what they're going to do year in and year out. This is the first year that they've run a solo back set for the most part. Right, Ramondre Stevenson is the clear-cut lead back, something that they haven't necessarily had in years past, and he is very good, but it doesn't necessarily matter how good he plays when they're so inconsistent throwing the ball for the entire first half. Miami got out to a lead, and Miami really controlled the tempo of the game for the rest of the game, despite Tua throwing a pick. Like, it just didn't matter. Tua fumbled twice. They ended up getting both of those back. Tua had the pick, and still they won by 7 points because no matter what New England did, their offense couldn't offset anything that their defense gave them. So you're looking at it's the same story that New England had in week 1, where they're better than you expect them to be, but they're worse than the team that they're playing, and they lost by 1 possession yet again. And on the flip side of this coin, Miami did look pretty good. Miami is standing up to adversity. Mike Daniels is looking like a genius at head coach for Miami. It did look like he outcoached Bill Belichick for the bulk of this game, which is not something that's easy to do. Raheem Mostert, coming over from the 49ers, looked terrific. He had 18 carries for 121 yards and 2 touchdowns. New England just didn't have an answer for him. And again, just like on offense, the Patriots are missing some skill players on defense. They have Matt Judon, but they were banged up in their secondary. And outside of Judon, their linebackers are questionable on a weekly basis. So the takeaway here is that, New England might be cooked. New England might be done. They might miss playoffs again. And, maybe they're good enough to stay in games, but they're definitely not good enough to finish these games. And I think that's going to be pretty telling what they end up doing in the offseason, because they have so many holes that they need to fill. And they went out and they spent all that money a couple years ago. And I just don't know what they're going to actually be able to do. It feels like we are truthfully in the fall of the Bill Belichick era, which sucks for New England fans, but it's terrific for the rest of us, because I don't know about y'all, but I hated the Patriots being the best every year. So this is good for the league, but terrible for New England, because they don't look good until the fourth quarter, really. And, Mac Jones is playing great then, but by then it's already too late. So it's going to be a rough season for the Patriots. And it should be a good year for the Miami Dolphins. They're the leader in their division, and they do look the best overall in the AFC East. So it's going to be interesting to see what Miami ends up doing as the year goes on, because if they can stay healthy, this might be the year that Miami loses into the Super Bowl to the 49ers or the Cowboys or the Eagles, which would be really cool just to see Miami make it. But that's going to wrap up the show this time around. I'm sorry that this show dragged on a little long again. I'm going to have to do a little better at kind of corralling some of these games so that I'm not spending too much time on them, so that y'all can really get the full enjoyment out of these shows. But with that being said, thank you all so much for tuning in. This past weekend, the show broke 100 downloads, and that was a huge deal for me. I have the greatest fan base in the world. Thank you all to everybody that actually listens to these shows. And I look forward to seeing you in a couple of days when I film the next one for the pre-cap for next week. Have a great night, and peace.